Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Canaan Library. My name is Heather Cimino. I work in the adult programming area of the library. Very, very excited to have Gil Harel with us tonight.
Thank you, Heather. Wow. Thank you, folks. Thank you for braving the elements to join me in this January program. And thank you to Heather for facilitating tonight's program and for preparing the multitude of videos that we're going to be watching. And make no mistake about it, we will be watching quite a few videos today. Good, bad, and on occasion, ugly. I'll talk a little bit about why I've elected to include some of the, if not the highlight reel, then perhaps the lowlight reel in this particular program. But first, let me just start by saying that you may have surmised that this is not exactly my usual topic that I explore. I am mostly concerned with choral music, opera, musical theater. In the past, I have given programs, for example, on Wagner's Ring Cycle at the New Canaan Library. The opera Tristan und Isolde, in which the metaphysical soul melts into the Schopenhauerian ether, and Tristan and Isolde can ascend to abide together in a different wavelength as they depart from their corporeal bodies to unite in metaphysical harmony. However, yes, some of us would like for me to talk about Tristan tonight, and perhaps a desideratum for the future. But tonight's program is going to be about something that is a little bit different, but of course very topical around this time of year. So I thank the New Canaan Library for giving me a forum for discussing a topic that I, quite frankly, had a lot of fun preparing. I want to be very candid and transparent with you and say that I am by no means an expert on football. I kind of follow football. I grew up in New York City, in Queens, so there was always some question about whether to root for the Jets or the Giants. Usually they were both atrocious, so it was a wash either way. The more things change, the more they stay the same, eh? Well, it was a rough season, and I apologize to all the Jets and Giants fans here. However, music is something I am deeply interested in, and popular music is something that as an academician, a member of the professoriate, and I guess I would put this in scare quotes and say a scholar of popular music, I have become increasingly interested in this particular subtopic. For example, some of you may have been here last May on the day of the I-95 Inferno when I talked about Taylor Swift's catalog. How many of you braved the Inferno on I-95 and were there? Yes, I suspect quite a few. I see some familiar faces. I think it's fair to say that popular music, for obvious reasons, is something that for everybody, irrespective of where your heart is, where your soul is perhaps, you may prefer the dulcet tones of a Puccini aria. Maybe for you, Nessun Dorma is the apotheosis of vocal music or music more broadly. Maybe you're a fan of Verdi, maybe you're a fan of Wagner. Maybe you love the cantatas of Johann Sebastian Bach, the symphonies, string quartets, and piano sonatas, of which there are 32, of Ludwig van Beethoven. Perhaps you're a real hardcore romantic and you love the music of Schubert and Schumann and Mendelssohn and Brahms and Mahler and the rest. We're not going to talk about them tonight. We're going to talk about what is, I think, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the most culturally important and significant events on the calendar. If we really take stock and we're honest, well, there's Christmas, sure. There's Thanksgiving, and there's the Super Bowl. In terms of a singular event that most Americans, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, follow or celebrate. I use that word loosely because, again, there are plenty of people who are even more indifferent, apathetic, nonchalant towards football than yours truly. I at least can tell you who's in the playoffs right now. I couldn't tell you many members of those teams. But there are people who are completely indifferent towards football, and yet we all have something in common, which is that on February 9th this year, probably just before 6 o'clock, we're going to go to someone's house or we're going to welcome people to our own houses, and we're going to put on the TV, and we'll have food, we'll have drink, perhaps we'll have some potent potables, to quote the late, great Alex Trebek, some booze, in other words, and we will watch this game, which some of us may have a very limited interest in, but nonetheless, whether you're watching because you want to see the commercials, how many of us are in that camp? I would call you Super Bowl fan adjacent, okay? How many of us are watching simply because it's the Super Bowl and you figured, well, it's the Super Bowl. What else am I going to do that night? I would suspect a few of us. Now, I believe that this coming Super Bowl, which is to take place on the 9th of February, is the 59th Super Bowl. And kudos to the NFL for keeping the numerals of the Super Bowl in Latin. That's really nice. I think this is a very good thing. People should learn their Roman numerals. And the Super Bowl is one of the only existing mass media enterprises that still uses Roman numerals to my knowledge. WrestleMania did it, by the way, but they don't do it anymore. Speaking of WrestleMania, you're thinking, that can't be a segue, Gil. This is insane. What does that have to do with the Super Bowl? One of the things we're also going to talk about this evening is the idea of counter-programming. What other networks did to piggyback on the popularity of the Super Bowl when they knew there are all of these people gathered around watching TV, and maybe those Super Bowl halftime shows starting in 1967 were a bit of a snooze fest, to be quite honest, unless you were a hardcore devotee of marching band music. Listen, I love a marching band as much as the next guy. In fact, little known trivia, a footnote to tonight's program, back in 2001, when 17-year-old Gil was a junior in high school, I was part of the Francis Lewis marching band on Francis Lewis Boulevard in Queens, New York. So I am no stranger to marching bands, and it tickled me when I was preparing my notes to learn that from 1967, really up until the 1990s, these halftime shows were primarily populated by marching bands. Not exactly a thrilling experience for most people watching at home on their itty-bitty television screens. Remember those screens? Remember the old CRT cathode ray television were 19 inches, or maybe you got the 27-inch Panasonic and you invited everybody over and you said, look at this baby. Unbelievable, huh? Never seen anything like it. Look at the size of this gargantuan machine. Anyway, fortunately, thanks to the modern miracle of YouTube, every single one of these halftime shows has been chronicled, including those perhaps less than stellar, lackluster, marching band-dominated halftime shows of yesteryear. We're not going to watch those. Just take my word for it. We've got enough bad halftime shows to watch tonight. We don't need to go back. And to all of the marching band fans for whom a good marching band is the apotheosis of instrumental music, well, my sincere apologies to you. I really, I don't have anything against marching bands, but we're talking about a mass media event. And therefore, it stands to reason that the tone and tenor of the Super Bowl halftime show was fated to change, and to change dramatically. The year that is often cited as the moment where, let's say, marching bands vanished, sort of low-budget acts, at least one or two of which we'll watch today, vanished, and all of a sudden, the highest caliber, most famous, most celebrated, most toasted, venerated pop stars took the stage. And that year is 1993. And why, or who I should say, elevated the essence of the Super Bowl halftime show, turning it into must-see TV. Don't change that dial. Remember back when we had a dial? It occurred to me that my kids, my wife is 39 weeks pregnant, by the way, with number 4, so it's really quiet and peaceful at home. But there are certain phrases that we use that are perhaps endemic to this era that would not make sense to them. They don't really know what forget turning the dial on a television. Everything in my house is operated by a certain Amazon denizen that I will not name in case someone's got it in the room here and starts asking for directions somewhere. But my kids, when they want to watch something, they just talk to the robot in the house. So the idea of changing the channel to them, they don't know what a channel is. They know what apps are, but a channel, not so much. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but again, the phrase, don't turn that dial, was very much at the core of booking Michael Jackson. Now, remember, in 1993, I think it's fair to say that Michael Jackson was past the pinnacle of his career. He was starting to veer into what some might call, I would never editorialize so boldly, some might call weird territory. He had begun to hyperpigment his skin, which is his choice, and whatever, that's not a big deal. But again, his appearance changed drastically, the nose, the skin color. His focus as a musician moved away from sort of more hip, disco-oriented numbers that we got in the 1980s, songs like Bad and Thriller, and Man in the Mirror, and we started to get songs like Heal the World. If you know Heal the World, Heather asked me if I wanted the piano tonight, and I thought about it, and I said, I am blessed in that I can usually listen to something and play it back after 1 or 2 hearings, but I don't know that it would have enhanced tonight's program for me to sit here on the keyboard and play Heal the World. And the reason is because the last 3 minutes of the song is the chorus on a loop. And kudos to Michael Jackson, because he starts in A major, and then better place for you and for me, heal the world, and all of a sudden he's in a new key, and then he finishes that chorus and he's in a new key. So it gives us this false sensation of something thrilling unfolding because the music is modulating higher. The pitch is ascending, which is something that obviously Michael Jackson would have been very, very well suited to pull off. He had this incredibly androgynous, very high tenor voice. Unlike me right now, some of you are hearing I'm getting over a cold from last week, and my voice about a half an octave lower than normal. So I won't be singing any Tristan solos tonight. You know, Michael Jackson was a big deal, and at the 1993 Super Bowl, this was a major statement from the NFL saying to the viewing audience at home. By the way, that viewing audience, even in the 90s, numbered in the tens of millions. Now it's even higher. It can crest over 100 million quite easily in terms of eyeballs watching the screens. So we're looking at a real turning point, I guess is what I would say. And if you want to impress your friends and neighbors on Super Bowl Sunday on February 9th this year, you can kind of gently elbow them in the ribs and say, hey, you know how the Super Bowl halftime show was such a big deal? You want to know when that started? 93. It was Michael Jackson, King of Pop. And just think how impressed your friends and family are going to be when you drop that on them. Let's watch a little bit of this. It started in a kind of interesting fashion with Michael Jackson at the top of this huge platform. You can see him in the video. And when he sings, he mostly sings his classic songs. So he's going to sing Billie Jean, which is obviously one of his best-known numbers, Billie Jean in F-sharp minor, in case anyone's wondering. And he ended the set with Heal the World, which, as I suggested earlier, starts in A major and then modulates to B major and then ends in D flat or C sharp, however he spells it. I don't think Michael Jackson worried too much about enharmonic spelling in music. But he was apparently a very good musician. Obviously, he was a good musician. He had great intonation. But what I mean by that is that he was facile with some of the nuts and bolts of music that we don't think about too often. One last thing I'll say about this before we watch is this was really it for Michael Jackson in terms of high-profile public performances of this scale. After this, he's going to fade further and further into obscurity, and I think many of us remember the controversies of the late 20th century and early 21st century with the Neverland Ranch and the boys who found their way to the Neverland Ranch, however they did, and drank wine out of Coke bottles, and were told by Michael Jackson that it was Jesus juice. All this stuff is on the record. It's a kind of an ugly part of the Michael Jackson biography, but it is there, and it's worth pointing out. All right, here's a little bit of the Super Bowl from 1993. For those of you who are really facile with your Roman numerals, you know that this is 27. Yeah. It gets harder once you crest 50, right? I think the ones in the 40s are the ones that give the people the most trouble because remember, when you're before 50, you have to subtract. You indicate whatever the number is by subtracting from the subsequent numeral. I can tell you that in music theory classes, we use Roman numerals all the time, but because we are working with what we call diatonic scales, we only go up to 7. In other words, it's like from C all the way up the scale to B, and that's it. All right, here is Michael Jackson, 1993, and one last note. For the purpose of clarity for our program, I will not be saying Super Bowl 27, Super Bowl 33. So I don't think anybody remembers. Even hardened devotees of the NFL may not immediately remember who played whom in which Super Bowl or who performed. I think the year is probably a more salient detail to have. So I'll introduce these by the performance year and not the actual number of the Super Bowl. And for the purpose of keeping things succinct tonight, I'm not going to talk about the Bills losing very badly in the Super Bowl or whoever beat who. Some of you will remember very specific Super Bowls based on the halftime show. For example, if you were especially invested in your team when Katy Perry sang, then that might be the cerebral cue for you where you think of Katy Perry and Super Bowl and you think that's when this team played and gosh, my team lost and I bet $100 and I lost. Damn Katy Perry. Some people will forge those connections. I'm going to mostly talk just about chronology, which I think is more interesting to us, and at least for the purpose of time is what we have a window to discuss. Here's Michael Jackson, and I think I have to unmute this, Heather, because he looks cool, doesn't he? Got to admit, that's a great look. Totally novel at this time in 1993. This particular detail vexed audiences at the time because he just stood there for about 90 seconds. I fast-forwarded about half of it, but I wanted to give you a sense of him just standing there with his sunglasses on, looking around sort of with this inscrutable look on his face. Oops. We're going to get a few of these tonight. We have to bear with it. Remember, this is a small price to pay for having literally a world of media at our fingertips. But don't you think it was worth it to watch Michael Jackson standing there for 90 seconds?
Shimona.
And of course, this is Billie Jean, right? All right, here's a 90s tune. You've got those signature falsetto hiccups from good old MJ. His dancing, you know, he never missed a beat with his dancing. That was always exceptional. And though he was spiraling, I think some would say, and there's probably a branch of musicology that will emerge in the coming years, if it's not already being written, of Michael Jackson's scholarship, even though he is devolving into, again, what we might broadly describe as an unusual visual aesthetic here, musically and in terms of his dancing, he's in top form. Now, some of you may have watched this and asked yourselves a very good question, a very piercing question. Is he really singing or is he lip syncing? The question of whether artists lip sync at the Super Bowl is one that has fascinated audiences for a very long time. I would suggest that there are any number of very egregious examples of performers lip syncing, both in the halftime show and also in the national anthem. There's that, I didn't prepare it, but I can show it to you very quickly. It was Jewel at the Super Bowl. And what happened was Jewel starts, singing. But the problem was, before she started singing, she got distracted and was waving at the fans. and forgot she was supposed to start. I guess they gave her some audio cue and she missed it. And so if you're wondering, are they lip syncing at the Super Bowl in general? Well, here may I present to you Exhibit A. There's John Elway, of course, from the Denver Broncos. Oops. Let's see that one more time. Watch the wave. Maybe she saw mom in the crowd. Who knows? And it's pretty egregious. Oops. There have been other, I know that's not the halftime show, which is our topic of the night, but it's adjacent, I would say, and it gives us a window into how the NFL does business. And I can tell you how the NFL does business when it comes to music. Whatever they're going to present, I can guarantee you that they have something, quote unquote, I'll use the terminology of the audio industry, something's in the can. They will have recorded a rehearsal. Sometimes they're even bold enough to use the radio edit, the radio recording, which can be really dicey because if you hear something at a live music performance and it sounds identical to what you've heard on the record, immediately the alarm bells go off for us, right? We hear something, and if it's a song we know well, and we've heard it, let's say through whatever medium, the CDs, analog cassettes, the internet, you've heard it any number of times. If you've heard The Weeknd or Katy Perry or Beyonce or Lady Gaga or any of these people who have performed in the last decade or decade and a half, you'll be familiar with the nuances and intricacies of that studio cut. And sometimes, I think my calculus is this. From the NFL's perspective, the average person is not scrutinizing the audio. They're there for the spectacle. That's really what the Super Bowl halftime show is about. It's pageantry, it's spectacle, it's pyrotechnics, it's costumes and dance, and the biggest names in the Billboard charts. And that's what they're banking on. And they don't really care if the music is live or not. Personally, after doing a deep dive, I found examples which to me sound like lip syncing and look like lip syncing. Some of them are hard to tell because, like the Michael Jackson video or even the Jewel video, you can tell this is before 16:9 HD formatting. So sometimes it's hard to tell. This is not hard to tell. Sorry, Jewel, we love you. But all right, let me show you a little bit about what came before Michael Jackson, because I know some of you are wondering, well, if Michael Jackson was the turning point, what came before it? I mentioned the marching bands. There was a kind of infamous show from 1991. The idea here was they were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Super Bowl halftime show, and they thought it would be a good idea to bring in some kids representing Disney. Now, I don't know about you, but the last time I checked, there isn't a whole lot of overlap between the demographic that sits down to drink beer and eat chicken wings and watch the Super Bowl and kids that like Moana. You might get them into it, although the second movie was not good, Heather. You know what I mean? I took my kid to see it. We went to see Wicked twice. We saw Moana 2. Das war genug, as they say in German. That was enough. At any rate, I don't get paid by Steven Schwartz or anybody to promote Wicked, but it was a great movie. At any rate, this wasn't so much a bomb because the performance was bad, objectively bad in terms of the merit of the performance. It was bad because I want you to watch this through the grizzled, not calloused eyes. Imagine you're a grizzled sort of blue-collar football fan with calloused hands who works in the machine shop or whatever, and you're watching the Super Bowl, oozing machismo, right? And then all of a sudden, Disney comes on at the halftime show with the New Kids on the Block, and hey, there's Donnie Wahlberg, and there's some kids singing It's a Small World After All. The problem was that remember, this is in February of 1991, so we're right after the start of the Gulf War. So it was not such a small world after all, at least not the cozy, fuzzy Disney world that we hear about in It's a Small World. So even though they probably could not have avoided it without radical changes at the last minute, it turned out to be a disaster, and this is widely regarded as one of the less good Super Bowl halftime shows. Let's watch it, and again, I want you to watch this not necessarily as parents who love Disney and love sharing the magic of Disney World with your kids, but as your average rough and tumble football fan who maybe is in their 30s or 40s or older and is maybe not so interested in watching Disney-oriented media in the Super Bowl, at least. Let me suggest that those last notes especially would probably not have gone over well with a lot of football fans. Not a lot of football fans that I know. And I used to live in Astoria, Queens when I was working at Baruch College. I worked there for 5 years. And not every Sunday, but occasionally on Sundays, I would go over to socialize with friends my age who were admittedly much bigger football fans than I was. And when I watch this, I just think of them. I think of them with their beer and their bongs. Am I allowed to say that? And I think, what would they have thought if something like this had come on during the Super Bowl halftime show? Do you see what I mean about the wrong tone? So we went from the marching bands to stuff like this. I'll give you one other really bad example. Here is Elvis Presto. Some of you are saying, who the hell is Elvis Presto? It's a good question. Well, he was a magician. Are you saying that they brought a magician to headline the Super Bowl? In 1989, they did exactly that. Here's Elvis Presto. And again, I want you to think about the sheetrock layer, the HVAC repairman, the plumber, the mechanic. I'm not saying these are the only people who watch football or who are allowed to watch football, by the way. Don't mistake what I'm saying. Everyone can enjoy football. But I would suggest, I don't have data to back this up, but I would suggest that broadly speaking, football is more likely to appeal to a certain type. And it's not the type that wants to see Elvis Presto at their halftime show. But nonetheless, it happened. Let's watch a little bit. When I think of Super Bowl fans, I think of hula hoops. Come on, who's not excited for an Elvis impersonator magician at the halftime show? Get that outfit. I would love to have that outfit. My kids would go nuts for it, I'm sure. Those are not real drums, by the way. Kudos to these kids. I'm sure they worked very hard. But if you watch this, oh, dare I say, and this is just me editorializing a little bit, it lacks a certain panache. It is not the most synchronized dancing. The Mariinsky Theater, it is not. However, with that said, you can see what they're going for. Yes, put the kids out there. You saw it in the New Kids on the Block video. You had a few professional dancers on the stage, and then there's some very enthusiastic kiddos in the background. And for some people, I think, especially if you're a parent of young children especially perhaps, this sort of thing might be compelling. But hearing the tenor version of Elvis Presley singing Elvis classics in a higher key as, images of Ace and Queen and King and playing cards pop into the graphics of the screen, maybe not the best recipe for success given the tone and tenor of what the Super Bowl has come to be about. Now, I know many of you were thinking, Gil, Professor, I thought we were going to see Paul McCartney. I thought we were going to see the Rolling Stones. I thought we were going to talk about Janet Jackson and the infamous event known as Nipplegate. I remember when that happened, and we will talk about it. But I think it's important to understand how we get to Paul McCartney. How do we get to U2 and these sort of more traditional, venerated musical acts? And a lot of it had to do with these misses. Michael Jackson, you could say, was a hit, but there were a lot of misfires in the late 90s. And we're not going to have time to watch them, but I would say that for many people, the moment that marked a kind of rebound for the NFL was 2002, when the band from the UK, U2, came in. And actually, they're Irish, right? I think they're Irish. Bono is Irish. And The Edge, Mr. Distorted Guitar, Mr. Delay Pedal, love The Edge. They came in and they did a show. And the reason I think this worked so well was because recall that in February of 2002, the nation was really still reeling from 9/11. And while the NFL could have opted to go with something more sensationalistic in nature, this was the turning point where most people who talk about Super Bowl halftime shows and study this sort of thing look and say, the NFL in the early 2000s was really interested in stability. They weren't trying to rock the boat. They weren't trying to ruffle feathers. They weren't trying to be avant-garde or push the envelope in any way. They wanted to get a traditional band that had a kind of mainstream appeal across generations. And U2 is one of those bands. I mean, they're still out touring. Good for them, right? Bono with his Bob Villa glasses and the rest of the band, they had hits that were very well known and that were, I would say, generally speaking, very upbeat or at least intending to be inspirational. I'll give you one example, which is Pride, open parentheses, in the Name of Love. Very famous song. Bono's voice absolutely soars on that song. It's a really well-written tune for his voice. Beautiful Day is another song from this era. Some of you will recognize these songs when I play them. Some of you won't. But suffice to say that these were big hits in the years 2001, 2002. And for the NFL, it was a safe bet to get U2. Notice I said get. I didn't say hire. I should probably say a little bit about how compensation works for the musical acts. Generally speaking, the NFL does not pay the performers. Is that exploitative? Well, obviously not at all. There has to be something in it for the performer. So what is in it? And the answer is there has been a very well documented spike in record sales, let's say cassettes, CDs certainly, and most of all MP3 downloads. Anybody who performs at the Super Bowl, if you look at the charts, in the week subsequent to the Super Bowl halftime performance, the sales spike. So even though they don't get paid, they wind up benefiting in a major way. One interesting note, the NFL did pay exactly once, and it was Michael Jackson. But they didn't pay him directly. They paid the Heal the World Foundation, which, as some of you will recall, was this altruistic, philanthropic outreach to Africa in particular. So they have paid. One note I should clarify is that they do pay for what you might call travel and accommodations. So if the Red Hot Chili Peppers are going to come play the Super Bowl, they're not going to get a check for playing, but the NFL will make sure that the members of the band, all of their sound people, their video people, their tech people, everybody who's coming along in their entourage gets flights, food, hotel vouchers, etc. So that's kind of how the economics, if you will, of the Super Bowl halftime show goes. Here's 2002, which featured U2. Again, I want you to think about this particular show as taking place in the shadow of 9/11 at a time when people were not interested, perhaps, in shows of a more sensationalistic nature. They wanted something familiar. They wanted something uplifting. And U2 songs, by and large, tend to be, I would say, and I'm generalizing here because I don't know the whole U2 catalog, but I am what I would call a U2 fan. I have played many of these songs. I have taught many of these songs in my music theory classes. Some of them have interesting chord progressions. And a lot of U2 songs are uplifting. You know, Pride in the Name of Love is a celebration of Martin Luther King, whose birthday we'll celebrate on Monday this coming week. You know, Sunday, Bloody Sunday is an homage, a kind of a celebration of people who were martyred in political violence and political upheaval. So these are not, it's not like some of the songs we're going to listen to at the end of the program, where the songs like, for example, the Janet Jackson, Justin Timberlake song, the infamous moment, that was Rock Your Body. And if we're pronouncing it with the correct diction and inflection that Justin Timberlake adopts, we should say, Rock Your Body. A little bit different than what we're going to hear in the short clip we're going to watch. Okay, I can tell you this is lip syncing, and you can hear it not so much in Bono's part, but because of the backing vocals. Watch the backing vocals here. Notice how high pitched they are. If you were really a tenor singing in that register way up there, you'd probably do this. If here's the microphone, you're going to do this, and you're going to belt those high notes. If it's, let's say, A, B flat, B, if you're above that and you're in that high territory, you're not going to sing it casually as if you're singing a nursery rhyme to your kids. It's a kind of a note in a stentorian range. And you could see the backup singers, they barely look like they're singing. Look again. Did you see that? Bono might be live. So again, what they'll do is they'll get the track in the can from the rehearsal. And then sometimes they mix and match. Sometimes they'll pipe in the instruments. Remember, there's an old axiom that I feel inclined to share right now about playing music. Ready? It's a good one. I tell it to my students all the time. You play better when you don't sing. And you sing better when you don't play. Anybody who goes into the recording studio to make a record, guess what? They're recording one at a time. They're not doing both. Why? Because no matter who it is, and there are some phenomenally talented people. I don't mean to suggest that pop singers are frauds. You know, Katy Perry complained that they wouldn't let her sing live. She really wanted to, apparently, and she was shocked at how much they insisted on dubbing in. There are people who have fabulous intonation, but the problem is if you're in an 80,000 or 90,000 seat outdoor venue, like a football stadium, it is notoriously difficult to get good acoustics for the performers, for them to hear themselves. They can have a monitor in their ear, they always do, but it's so hard to get a good balance, a good mix. There's crowd noise, which can be deafening. And also remember, how much time do they have to set this up before they go out and play the Super Bowl halftime show? Halftime comes up, and you've got, 8 minutes to set up. Do you know how much equipment? You can see it. You don't need to be an audio engineer to see how much equipment is involved here. And there have been moments, for example, there was that infamous moment, I think it was in 2014 with Bruno Mars, who, by the way, I think did a great job. He sat there and played the drums for the first part of the set. Hard to fake that, by the way. Very hard to fake playing the drums, and playing very well with good timing and good kick pedals with his feet. And then the Red Hot Chili Peppers came on. And of course, other than being shirtless, which is what you can expect from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, what you also saw was Anthony Kiedis walking around with a microphone that wasn't plugged in. Okay, you could plausibly make the case that there's a wireless mic. Although again, in a venue that size, it's a harder sell. If you know audio, that's a harder sell. But the weirdest thing in that video, maybe we'll watch it, is when they pan to Flea. Many of you know Flea is the bassist in the Red Hot Chili Peppers. he is jamming out, and I mean viscerally jamming out. He looks like he's having either a really good time or a seizure. Up and down and up and down, the hair is tossing, and he is, playing the bass with this very unconventional technique. Not like this. This is usually how bass guitarists play. He's almost playing it like he's strumming it. Very percussive approach to bass playing, which he's known for. Slap bass and a lot of use of the thumb. And yet the bass isn't plugged in. Folks, there is such a thing as a wireless mic. You can get an SM58 that works just fine in a room like this. I would suggest it would be wholly inadequate in a venue the size of a football stadium. But I have never seen a wireless electric bass guitar. How on earth would that instrument transmit its signal to broadcast to 90,000 people live? So we can see why the NFL always has this backup plan. It's not to cast aspersions or to denigrate the performers, most of whom, not all, but most of whom are very fine live musicians. Not all famous musicians, by the way, are great live musicians. For those of you who are caught up with contemporary pop crooners and divas, ready for a peek behind the curtain, what I've been working on over the break. Over the break, I compose music, mostly choral music, and I write all sorts of music. I just finished a big choral piece, a setting of Psalm 101. I'm excited to work on that with the chorus. But I've also been working on a cappella arrangements. I've written about 103 at this point. I'm working on my 104th. And in doing so, I've been doing some research, and someone who we might see at a Super Bowl halftime show is Olivia Rodrigo. She is, I hate to spoil this for you Olivia Rodrigo fans, she is a subpar live performer when compared to someone like Sabrina Carpenter, who's got a much firmer sense of pitch. And I compared and contrasted and watched a few videos to make sure I wasn't just getting it off it. She's fine, but she's not a, ace tier or S tier, as people say. All right, so that's a little bit of Bono and company in 2002. We'll watch a few clips from the ensuing years, and some of these are good and some of these are not so good. Janet Jackson, not so good, but not for reasons that had to do with performance. The Who, not so good. Coldplay, great. Paul McCartney, that was in 2005. Let's watch a little bit of this. Now, I skipped over 2004. Many of you are thinking, 2004. You're rubbing your chin like Rodin's thinker. What happened in 2004? Anybody? Janet Jackson, yes. That was when the nation writ large had to learn the word areola. I skipped that to show you the aftermath. The aftermath, when you had what was called Nipplegate or Janet Gate, was bring on the most sort of comforting voice, the most familiar sound and face, somebody who's written any number of classics for multiple decades, who obviously had a prestigious career as a headlining voice in the Beatles, widely recognized as one of the great songwriters of the century, had more success with Wings, solo albums. Let's get Paul McCartney. This was a backlash against Justin and Janet. Let's watch. We'll watch this, then I'll show you 06, then we'll go back to 04. I went back and listened to the studio cut. This is live. Almost certainly this is live. Notice, gone the flashy pyrotechnics. We don't have elaborate fireworks displays. We don't have dancers clad in shiny sequined outfits or anything like that. It's just a familiar, comforting face who's got a catalog that at least part of that catalog is going to be familiar to everybody. So they start with Baby You Can Drive My Car. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but I think it's, to some degree, it's known. A typical Super Bowl halftime show features about 12 minutes of music. The videos themselves will be closer to 13 with all the editing, the introduction, and the outros. Let's see what Paul is doing later on in the program. Oh. Well, it better be good, Sir Paul. By the way, I should point out that Paul McCartney is one of very few musicians to breathe truly rarefied air in the music business. And what I mean by that is just on a fiscal level, he is one of very few musicians to have become a billionaire. It's very hard to become a billionaire as a musician. There are a handful of them. You know, Beyonce is a billionaire. I think Kanye West was a billionaire. Hopefully he's not anymore. Taylor Swift is certainly a billionaire. She just crested $1 billion net worth a couple of years ago. Andrew Lloyd Webber, he's a billionaire. Even though he ripped off Puccini in Phantom of the Opera. You know, the music of the night steals right from Quello che tacite from Act 1 of La Fanciulla del West of 1910. I actually like Andrew Lloyd Webber. Hey, you know, Heather, maybe we'll have some Andrew Lloyd Webber programs at some point in the future. He's misunderstood. People think that he just wrote tourist schlock. Well, he's no Sondheim, let's put it that way. But what I would say to that is some people like tourist schlock. Anyway, how'd we get here? Billionaires. Sir Paul, we just waited 5 seconds for this ad. Let's see what you got for us. He's moved to the piano. And again, I suspect that the singing is live, the piano playing is probably not. We'll be able to tell if the camera pans to the fingers. If they do that, he's probably really playing. If they don't, that's a window into the answer. This is a song, of course, that's intertwined with the James Bond franchise and Paul's career after the Beatles, and it's a great tune. It really, it's harmonically very interesting, has a very unusual melodic contour, kind of has this smoky backroom feel, which is in a way perfect for a movie that has to do with espionage and that sort of thing. And let's see, of course, what he ends with. We didn't look at any endings. We'll look at our first one tonight. What do you think it's going to be? Anybody remember? Yeah, of course. Now, can you think why Hey Jude would be on the program? Think of the coda. Sing along. If you can get 90,000 people singing along, that's good. And if the ending of the song goes, na, 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 Hey Jude, well, you don't have to have a particularly erudite audience with respect to the Paul McCartney catalog. Let's go to the end here. Oh,
now taxis.
Sir Paul, it's going to be worth it, folks. Don't worry. Sir Paul's not going to let us down. He is playing, yeah. He's definitely singing live there. You can hear his voice is not 1,000,000% in tune. It's there, whatever. But on that high note, you can hear just a little wobble in the intonation, which, by the way, happens to even the most highly trained Met opera stars. It doesn't matter who it is. We are not robots. And I, for one, appreciate it because it tells us that Sir Paul was actually singing. Right here. You hear that? Pretty good, pretty good. Gotta love the glissandi on the piano. The truth of the matter is, when you watch that wide shot or some of these audience shots, this in some way, I think, represents for many fans of Super Bowl-related media, this is kind of, and I hate to use an insipid phrase, but this is what it's all about, right? A familiar, soothing voice, tunes you can sing along with, maybe tunes that have some element of nostalgia or wistfulness, bring us back to a bygone era. and make us feel young again, perhaps. And you can get 90,000 people singing on the coda because, again, the lyrics are, na, 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 hey Jude. The NFL tried this again in the subsequent year, in 2006, and they brought out the Rolling Stones, and we're a little short on time because I do want to leave time for Q&A. But suffice to say that 2006 was a bit of a dud. Why? Well, there have been a couple of moments like this in halftime show history. One involves the Rolling Stones in 2006. Another involved The Who just a few years later. And they both suffered from the same problem. Now, I grew up listening to classic rock. I'm sure many of you did too. So if you did, you think of The Who or you think of the Rolling Stones in very high esteem. You hold them in high esteem, I should say. The problem was by 2010, The Who were a little weathered. And I think when it comes to the Stones, well, you have to admire Mick Jagger's fortitude to keep going and plugging away. But I think when it comes to Jagger and a lot of other artists, sometimes we wish they would just hang up their boots and enjoy retirement. Because a few things happen. One, there is this, let's call it the paradigmatic example of the aging rocker. And at a certain point, no matter who you are, no matter how much vitality you have, no matter how much human growth hormone you're taking or whatever supplements you're taking, Father Time does no jobs, as they say. You can't outrace Father Time. You can't beat Father Time. And with both The Who, especially the case with The Who, Roger Daltrey had just had surgery for removing a precancerous growth on his vocal folds. So he got in there, and I don't know, if ever there was a year to dub them and bring in the lip syncing, it should have been them, but they didn't. And Pete Townsend looked like he was on drugs, and Daltrey looked like he was going to have a coronary episode. And it was, again, it didn't smack of the vivacious, vigorous vitality. I like to be alliterative once in a while. It didn't smack of all of those elements which are intertwined with football and this sort of machismo that is attached to it. It just looked like guys who used to be great and couldn't hack it anymore and should have probably been on a really comfy sofa watching the game and watching the show from home. That's not necessarily my opinion, but that's, if you were to read critical reviews contemporarily from publications like Rolling Stone, that's what you'd see. They were very harsh. They're very critical. All right. As we come to the end of the program, I want to do two things. I want to address 2004 with Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake. It was an event that basically ended Janet Jackson's career. For those of you who followed her career, she had a waxing ascent for about 20 years, from the 80s, mid-80s until 2004, and that was really it for her. Was it her fault? Well, yes and no. It takes two to tango, and Justin Timberlake is the one who actually was responsible in some way for the wardrobe malfunction. The thing is, Janet also was responsible, and here's how. She decided that she was going to make the whole show, have it a little bit of spice, a little bit of Janet's own sauce. And she told precisely nobody about this, including the NFL. And what did that mean? It meant that whatever undergarment she was supposed to wear under the leather brassiere, whatever it is that she's wearing in that dance routine, the dance routine on its own was utterly salacious to begin with. If you watch it, there's tushy grabbing, there's intimated physical congress. It's not a PG kind of show. And remember, plenty of kids, I know in my house, like, we let our kids stay up to watch the halftime show and then they go to bed after the halftime show. It's like one of the few days of the year where, like, we really let them stay up and it's a preordained thing. So there are kids watching this of all ages, teenagers who are, maybe their heads are filled with salacious thoughts, and this is not the sort of thing you want them seeing if you're a parent. So she had decided that instead of wearing this more stable garment, she was going to wear essentially a very flimsy red lace underneath. And not even Justin Timberlake knew about it, and it was different than what they had rehearsed. So when he went to pull away the garment, the last lyric, I should say, in Rock Your Body goes something like this, and I'll get you naked at the end of the night, something like that. And of course, that spurred all sorts of rumor and innuendo that this was somehow deliberate. It may have had some element of that because, again, Janet Jackson had to know what was on the table, what was at stake, but nonetheless, it led to a huge controversy. Remember that Colin Powell, I think one of his family members was the head of the FCC at the time, And, okay, so you've got George W. Bush in the White House, and Colin Powell's nephew or brother or whoever it is running the FCC. And maybe there was a political element to it. Generally speaking, what was that guy's name? L. Brent Bozell. He was from that conservative Parents Television Council, something like that. So lawsuits flew. And for Justin Timberlake, he had to lay low for about 2 years. And when he resurfaced, he was okay. He emerged more or less unscathed and has had a very prosperous career, although as many of you saw this past year, good old Justin got a DUI. Or maybe it was a DW. I don't remember which it was. But we should all be so blessed to look that good in a mugshot. He looks incredible. I mean, the guy's like 52. He looks the same as he did in his NSYNC days. What I think is kind of interesting about the 2004 show is that it was the end of Janet Jackson's career for the most part. She did release albums after it. Can anybody name any of them? Can you name a Janet Jackson hit after 04? All right, well, maybe that's, as they say, circumstantial evidence that her career was impacted detrimentally by this. Who have we seen in the last 15 or 20 years? Well, it's mostly big pop stars. In recent memory, it's people like The Weeknd. Right? Now, you might say, who's The Weeknd? Well, he's a very influential R&B performer, or at least was in 2021. In 2022, you got a bunch of R&B performers, including Snoop Dogg, who was almost certainly under the effect of THC at that performance, which, if you know Snoop Dogg, is par for the course. Generally speaking, the Super Bowl halftime show gets the eyeballs locked in, and most people these days, I think, stay pinned to the halftime show. I mentioned that there was some impetus in the 1990s to really come up with compelling material because other programs were counter-programming. They would have, for example, I'll just give you my favorite example, the most famous actor, or at least one of the most highly paid actors in the world right now, none other than my personal hero and yours, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, had a wrestling match against another wrestler by the name of Mick Foley, and the WWF at the time called it Halftime Heat. And it did bonanza ratings because it was in 1999 and nobody cared about the Super Bowl halftime show, or comparatively few did. And the WWF at the time was able to get a lot of that audience. They did, I think they got like an 8.5 in the Nielsen ratings, which means, let's take it a 1-to-1. That's like 8.5 million people are tuning in. It's incredible. Nowadays, the NFL is not going to gamble with that. They're going to give you the biggest acts, the most highly touted acts, and that's going to include everybody, again, from the last 15 years. Think of Beyonce, Rihanna. Think of The Weeknd I mentioned, Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, and sort of names that maybe are more associated with the rap idiom, hip-hop idiom. And then you get sometimes these collaborative crossovers. And the one I mentioned earlier with Bruno Mars, he's kind of an R&B guy, and he did a show with the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Remember, that was the one where Flea's playing the unplugged bass guitar. The Chili Peppers, to their credit, said the following. They said, well, we knew we were going to be lip-syncing and unplugged, so we just did the best we could, and we tried to make it look plausible. And we figured it was better than standing up there and having no energy. So anyway, I know many of you will be tuning in on February 9th to watch the halftime show, and I hope this program has given you some perspective on the history of that halftime show. This has been an unconventional program for all of us, I think. And I want to thank Heather for helping to organize and facilitate it, get the word out, and most of all, thank you for coming out on a 25-degree night in January to hear me talk about Super Bowl halftime shows. You guys are awesome. I'll take any questions you have if I can't answer them. That's a good question. Was there some cross-marketing there because Michael Jackson represented the Pepsi-Cola brand? Maybe that is part of it. My research was mostly relegated to reading about the actual and watching and assessing musical performances, so I didn't read about that. It's possible. It was mostly born, from what I've read, it was mostly born out of the dud performances of the early 90s. The New Kids on the Block, the Disney 25th anniversary show. They just fell utterly flat with audiences, and the NFL thought, you know what, who's the biggest name out there? Who's the king of pop? Literally, it's Michael Jackson. Let's do Michael Jackson. I would say that the scope of the event changed in the 90s. They went with marching bands really consistently through 67 through the 80s. And that, of course, is indicative of football's roots in college football. Remember, many of these players are coming from college, and in college football, marching bands are huge. I know this because I have colleagues who, for example, teach at the University of Michigan. And for them, their musical focus in terms of live music at their university is, to some degree, extraordinarily bound up with Saturday and with games at the big house. And those marching bands, they might have 200 music majors or more. filling up those stadiums. So it's a big deal, and we don't really have that in the Northeast. I can't think of anything comparable. Sure, Yale has a marching band, I think, and I'm sure there are others at big schools or prestigious universities that have marching bands, but it's not a thing here. We don't really talk about marching band music. And that was kind of, a lot of culture is downstream of bi-coastal politics, I guess I'd say. And if people on the coast in LA or in New York are not interested in marching bands, then they're going to shift to something that has more mass appeal. Yeah, that's a good question. So that will, whether it's a nighttime game or not really depends on where they are. If they're on the East Coast, it'll be a nighttime game by halftime. If the game starts at 6:30, halftime show is before 9 o'clock, shortly before 9, where in February it's dark. However, if they're in California, and they've had plenty of Super Bowls in Anaheim or in Glendale, Arizona, then you're going to get a different sort of feel. I think there probably is something to what you suggested, that when it's in the dark, well, what happens then? Then the pyro is more visually arresting. When we go to watch the fireworks on July 4th, we don't go at 3 in the afternoon. You go at night because the contrast, the relief of light and dark is more pronounced. Yeah. Yes?
You addressed something about the year they had Prince perform.
Yes.
And it was heavy rain.
Yeah.
And the impact of that.
Yes, so that year, 2007, is considered one of the most exciting performances, the Prince performance in '07. And, you can't write a better drama than a torrential downpour while Prince is playing Purple Rain. And he did something kind of unusual and nifty. He went behind a screen, and so there was this silhouette of him jamming and playing a really good guitar solo. And it's really him. You read about that Super Bowl, and there were concerns that something could go wrong with the equipment. Music equipment, sound equipment is pretty resilient. It can withstand the elements to a degree. But if there's a torrential downpour and you've got 1/4-inch cables and XLR cables, you can try to tape it as best you can, but there's a risk that something goes really wrong. And Prince insisted on going out and going live. And he played that solo, and he plays it live. And it's pouring rain, and there he is. And it's awesome. It's Purple Rain in the rain. That one, I think, will always have a special place for fans of this particular phenomenon. Yes?
Do you know which halftime had the highest rating?
Good question. It might be something that would surprise us. Like, for example, I'm trying to remember whoever it was. Maybe it was The Weeknd in 2021. That was early in COVID. So it's not something we would think about immediately. But if everybody's home, nobody's going out at the bar, that means you're going to have more eyeballs on individual screens rather than 50 people watching one screen in a bar. So in terms of pure ratings, it might have been the COVID-era Super Bowls. You have these half-empty stadiums. But people everyone remembers that. We were all looking for something to watch. So I don't know. It'd be a good question for an enterprising Super Bowl historian to look into. That's a good question. I'll say what any good academician should say, which is I'd have to look it up. Katy Perry, great, yeah. Well, she's objectively an extraordinarily good-looking woman. I say this as a happily married husband and father of soon-to-be 4. But she's a good-looking woman, and I don't personally like her songs as much as I like, for example, Taylor Swift's. But don't hate me, guys. Please come back to the next program, even if you're a Katy Perry super fan. But that makes sense, yeah. You're talking about appeal. She has her hands over key demographics that maybe are going to augment the pool, namely teen and preteen girls, who are the least likely people, I think it's fair to guess, the least likely people to watch the Super Bowl. So if you're getting the usual Super Bowl clientele plus the teen and preteen girls, because it's Katy Perry, it stands to reason you would get the best ratings. Yeah, that makes sense to me. That's a great question. I think it's, again, cast the widest net possible. You look at the show with Bruno Mars, I think it was 2014, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Bruno Mars was all the rage in 2014. He had those songs, Grenade, that's not his best known song, but what was the one? Want to Be a Billionaire, that was another one. There's bigger ones that I'm forgetting, but he was a big deal back then. And he had this kind of very compelling, almost Michael Jackson-esque androgynous voice where he could sing way sky high into the tenor and even into the alto range. So Bruno Mars was a big deal, but who's he a big deal with? People roughly guessing under 45. So people over 45 in 2014, who are they going to want to see? Who's a more familiar sight to them? The Red Hot Chili Peppers, let's say. And the idea with a collab is you get to see this cross-generational, meeting of different decades. And it's kind of fun to see, Bruno Mars singing Give It Away, because that's not a song he sings. He sings Bruno Mars songs. He doesn't cover Red Hot Chili Peppers. So there's a novelty to it as well. But I think it speaks to the tone and tenor that the NFL is trying to project, which is one of sort of broadly writ American unity through pop culture and through sort of easy listening. Wouldn't it be great if they played Ride of the Valkyries at the halftime show? Anyway, my friends, I will wish you all a good night. Thank you for coming. I look forward to seeing you at the next one.